Okay, we're back on. The introduction ought to get better. This is the third time around, so or maybe it'll get worse. Maybe it'll get worn out with it. I don't know. Anyway, I'm Bob Mathis. I've been a part of the Healthy Congregations organization since about 2006 or 2007 when it first came to Columbus, and worked with Dr. Ott in that. She cannot be here today. I'm glad to be able to sit in for her with my friend Tony Wilgus. And the purpose of these, keep in mind, is to take a look at one person's experience or application with this thing called Bell and Family Systems Theory. So Tony is faculty emeritus from University of Findlay, Ohio. He finished there last July, just this past summer. And prior to that, you were in Michigan and social worker there and also in administration, correct?
That's correct, Bob.
I just want to stop for 1 second. Are you hearing us better? Because I guess some of the mic issues were external and not something we could control. Looks like the reports are good. Well, the other thing is occasionally I'll be looking past Tony up to a screen up there. That's where your questions will come in to me. So thanks for your patience with this, and sorry if it was glitch. Tony, well, I want to know, to start off with, where did you first get plugged in or learn about this thing called Bell and Family Systems Theory?
Well, thank you, Bob. And by proxy, thank you, Dr. Emily Ott, for inviting me to be as part of a Healthy Congregations program. It was rather serendipitous, my initial exposure to Bowen theory. I was in a graduate program in social work at the University of Michigan. And one of the professors there, who is now a pioneer in social work, Dr. Ann Hartman, had recently come to Michigan. And in taking a class with her, she reviewed a number of theorists, one of whom was Dr. Murray Bowen. She also did an advanced family class in which a dozen of us presented our family diagrams. And for whatever reason, that particular way of thinking about humans resonated with me. As I was leaving Michigan, one of my classmates indicated that the Georgetown Family Center had a postgraduate training program for folks in the mental health profession, psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. About a year out after I was practicing clinical social work in Michigan and looking for something more than the supervision I enrolled in the postgraduate training program between 1979 and 1981. So that was the route that initially took me to the Georgetown Family Center and Dr. Bowen's work.
So what year was that in Michigan? I'm just curious.
I was in the graduate program at Michigan between 1976 and 1978.
Okay. I'm just always curious about evolved itself in university settings. And this was taught as a theory among other ideas, and probably a section was used for that purpose. Is that right?
Yes, at Michigan, not unlike many other graduate programs in social work, there were various concentration areas, mental health or community action, community organization, and I chose the concentration of families. Part of the coursework involved with that was an overview of the major theorists at the time, and unbeknownst to me, but this was the burgeoning heyday of the whole field of family therapy, and the shift from a more individual-focused psychoanalytic ego psychology model, and there was a lot of excitement about the work of a variety of family therapists, one of whom was the work of Dr. Murray Bowen. So I got it as a sliver of an approach in a course.
by the way, that's not too uncommon even today.
Right.
It's still to be taught.
That's
delivered
correct.
in a coursework.
That's
program. You coming back to this thing, you kept it plugged in. I mean, you went to the Wellness Center right off the bat, so you must have, it really struck a bell with you.
That's a question that I continue to ask myself. What is it about a particular way of thinking that will resonate with a person, that will propel them, as for me, in a way that changed not only my professional life, but my personal life? I've asked my question growing up in a family in which my father particularly would say, there's nothing more important than family. Was it the orientation of my religious beliefs, growing up as a Roman Catholic, and the tremendous focus there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and continues to be on the family? Was it a portion of my own brain that somehow could read the work of Freud, that could read the work of the behaviorist Skinner and the ego psychologist, but reading the work of Dr. Bowen, it just triggered, aha, there's something to this. So that's still a bit of a mystery to me, and I think each person who is involved with whatever way of thinking about the world that makes sense to them, I think, ask themselves.
Sure.
Good question, though.
Something that's always intrigued me is what keeps people plugged into this. We have your family diagram up here, and will you tell us about this person in this family?
Sure. I tried to not make this too cluttered as family diagrams can be. The principal under investigation here, yours truly, in his family of origin, he is the oldest brother of a brother and two younger sisters. There was an 11-month difference between siblings here, his younger brother, and an 11-month difference between the younger siblings. I don't know, maybe the term Irish triplets comes to mind, devout Catholic family. And then 4 years later, youngest sibling. The mother of this individual came from China, and she was the last of a large group of siblings that grew up in China and met a young soldier. They were both at the age of 30 back in 1945. The father was the youngest of four, and he was quite smitten with his wife. And between the time of their meeting on November 1st and their marriage, December 15th, 6 weeks had elapsed. And he then shipped back to the States. She had to stay in China, not only to follow 4 months later. Unbeknownst to both of them at the time of his departure, she was pregnant with yours truly, who happened to be born 9 months and 5 minutes after his parents' wedding day. So he was truly, as his father would say, a honeymoon baby. 4 months after the departure of her husband, her young husband, she then left China, leaving her mother and a variety of siblings, never to return and never to see them again, and took up residence in her husband's family's home. He lived with his mother at the time, and by the way, interestingly, she was living with her mother at the time, both of them aged 30, and two youngest that paired up and proceeded to live in the maternal family home for approximately 4 years before they secured their own home. So that's my sibling position. And related to, this is And I talked about it in the chapter for those of you who've read it. This is my first wife. The marriage lasted not quite 6 years. One child was a product of that relationship. This wife he met in graduate school in social work, and they thereupon had 2 daughters. She died in 2002 of MS, and the chronicling then of the third marriage, which was in 2005, and her 2 children by a prior marriage. So that's a little bit of an overview of the landscape of the cast, some of the cast of characters.
All right, go back up here. Just a question. Do you see yourself as a functional only? 11 years difference between you and the next born brother, is that correct?
11 months.
Oh, 11 months.
Correct.
That's a little different than 11 years.
Right.
No wonder you looked at me strange when I said functional only. No, you're a big brother of a brother and sisters.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And they might even agree with that.
I bet they would. Okay. Again, I know you said this. Your mother never went back to, or was never able to be with her family again. What about her extended family? Was there any connection there?
Part of, there's a number of interesting factors that go into immigration, migration, geographical relocations. If it's appropriate, I'll speak to some of the family process that gets involved in that. And this occurred while I was at Michigan with Dr. Hartman. My first name is Anthony, and in one of these family courses, I met with Dr. Hartman, and she said, "Well, who are you named after?" And people in the discipline are interested in naming patterns. And I said I was named after St. Anthony, the patron of the lost and found. My mother had made a promise as a devout Catholic to St. Anthony that if she ever found an appropriate man to marry, her firstborn son would be named Anthony. Dr. Hartman thought that was interesting, but then raised also the question that in some ways, St. Anthony, the patron of the lost and found, was an expression of the mother's loss of her home country, loss of some connections, face-to-face contact with important people in her family, and finding a new family, finding a new country. The way this played out in the life of this particular individual is that I became the repository of stories about her family and life in China. And 2 elements are particularly relevant here. She identified very closely with her father, who was by now in his 50s when she was born. And she described him as a very learned man, a very kind man, a voracious reader, and a member of the St. Vincent de Paul Society. When I was in graduate school in social work, and of course, I had thought that I had picked social work on my own, I stumbled upon, through an active search, the obituary of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. Yes. In the first line of his obituary, it stated, he was better known in the Shanghai community as a social worker. So that was very humbling to find out that this man who died 3 years before I was born, this ghost, somehow was shaping the trajectory of my career. There's another piece that gets involved in that. In Shanghai, the mother grew up across the street from a Jesuit university. So as a young boy, he was regaled with stories of the importance of the Jesuits and how much they meant to the family. So at the ripe old age of 5 years old, he recounted making the decision to enter the Society of Jesus. And one can smile about that in retrospect, but that was a very powerful story and influence that carried him, that once he graduated from high school, he entered the Jesuit seminary. And I guess a way of thinking about that particular process is that could be illustrative of the degree of fusion that was had between the mother and the oldest son, and some of the issues that she had in leaving her own country, and some of the undifferentiation too that runs pretty solid in the family.
You know, one of the things I regularly ask clergy when I'm working with them is how you got called into ministry, or how you identify your call into ministry. And often, well, without exception, there has been some connection that's been the presence of the past. That's somewhat what you're describing in your situation, up to this grandfather that you never met.
That's correct.
The other thing that strikes me about this, that is this could look like cutoff with your mother and her family. If a person were just looking at this kind of topically and say, oh, she's cut off. But the stories kept her connected. And she wasn't cut off. Plus, she wasn't running from something. She was pursuing the relationship with your father and her family. Does that make sense? Does it fit for you?
Yes, there's a couple of things in there. Just the term emotional cutoff, one of the core concepts, one of the 8 concepts within bone theory. And I had a very superficial, and still do, a very superficial understanding about that particular concept. But Dr. Bowen, in my interpretation, spoke about the running away from important relationships that this concept describes. And one can run away geographically so that one is highly allergic to formerly important people in one's life, so maintains a physical distance. The other part of emotional cutoff is to somewhat go underground and then to be in the presence of important people, but they never know what's going on. There's no person-to-person identification. My understanding in this highly togetherness-oriented family that I described of my parents and myself is that she was a focused upon youngest child by her own mother, who was still living at home at the age of 30. And so a version that emotional cutoff can be the inability to actually separate and to leave home. And when she did, she took the intensity from that relationship and then propelled it into the family in which she now was now married into. And some of the distance that I describe in the chapter between her and her husband, because her husband, as we get into the interlocking triangles, was a youngest, quite dependent upon his mother. So a very virulent triangle became that of the new wife, the new husband, and his mother. And she looked to lean on him, and this is, again, my interpretation based on theory. And consequently, in the absence of some of her husband meeting her perceived needs, she turned instead to lean on her eldest child, who became kind of the over-functioning one in relationship to her. It's a long-winded way of saying, yes, there are elements, in my view, of emotional cutoff. Not extreme. She would keep herself at a distance from siblings. She rarely wrote or kept in touch with them. And later, two important people in my own life would come to be an older sister and a brother who stayed in better contact with the larger family network, and they eventually became a resource to me. How does one appropriate a theory? In graduate school, I was introduced to the theory. Dr. Bowen's book was just in the process of coming out. The Phil Guerin book, Family Therapy, Dr. Bowen had a piece in there, I believe, Theory in the Practice of Psychotherapy, Theory in Psychotherapy. And in that, he described emotional cutoff. Following graduate school, my mother had an older half-brother up here who lived out west, and I had never met him before. So based on a little bit of information, I made a decision to go visit this older half-brother. Her father had been married twice. His first wife had died of smallpox. He had 5 children by that marriage, and then married her best friend and had 10 children by that marriage. So there was no contact between this woman and her older half-brother. And then families scattered pretty much throughout the world after the communist takeover in China. So there were siblings that went to Germany and Australia and Brazil and Canada, and a couple came to the States. When I made overtures to her older half-brother, pretty naive about theory and wanting to share that, I told my mother that I was going to take a trip to see her older half-brother, thinking that she would be quite overjoyed about that. I was taken aback by her degree of reactivity relative to visiting this older half-brother. And then I began to hear family stories about how much he had been a disappointment to her parents, things that I had never heard about. And so these kinds of small, microscopic, yet big encounters with the theory suggested there's something to this that continued to be an impetus for staying on the course with it. When I began to see it in the flesh, face to face, and then consistently underestimate the power of the family process, and my being consistently humbled by it and done in by it, if you will, was one way that the theory began to get a tad bit more congruent with what my thinking was and what I thought to be Dr. Bowen's thinking was.
So there was a fit between your experience in family and your readings and studies about family from a system perspective.
Yes.
Let me go to your father's family. Did you have a couple of things, first of all? One is, did you have similar connections with that family? And I'll take the other question separately. Let's just stay with that one. How did theory evolve in that side of the family?
Well, as I understand some of the theory, all of us are involved in a triangle with our parents. And sometimes that triangle can get pretty intense. And you try to move in one direction, you try to move in a direction. I'll give you an example. Part of the effort was to establish a person-to-person relationship with each parent. And there was a period when I would attempt to pry my father away from my mother. Let's go do something together. My father loved college football. When I was at Michigan, I said, Dad, I get tickets to the Michigan football games. And let's go to a Notre Dame football game. Every Catholic is a Notre Dame fan, aren't they? But he would consistently say, well, I can't leave your mother. And in the triangle with my parents, I came to see that I was my mother's child. I was going to be the priest. Not just a priest, a Jesuit of all things, my goodness.
The learned.
Yes, the Marine Corps of the Catholic Church. So when we talk about clergy, and of course I'm taking great glee in watching Pope Francis and some of his ministrations. But in the triangle with my parents, I was in an over-close relationship with my mother and a very distant and conflictual relationship with my father. And then when things would heat up between the two of them, I would inevitably side with my mother, thinking what a son of a gun he was. Trying to run at that thing and maneuver a different position was so difficult for me.
Did you get looked at as a traitor, or you were something about that wasn't good that you would move in his direction?
To try to maneuver in a fairly intense triangle, one way that I came to see to open it up a little bit was the use of the extended family. So relative to, and I can tell you stories about that, I began to think about, well, what if I just spent some time with his mother, even as a young boy? I was special to my grandmother. Or what if I spent time with his older sister? I'll just take her out to lunch, and not to ask her questions or try to get family history, but the idea in it was to try to develop a relationship with her, to get to know her as a human being, to see my father not as my father, but as a younger sibling of 4 younger siblings. And of course, in the process of developing that, I began to hear stories, and I began to develop another perspective on the intensity that I don't think I could have in that primary parental triangle. So that, and let me give you, for instance, Dr. Papro has talked about we grow up in families that have a perception of the world and how the way the world works. So my father grew up as the youngest boy in a family, and his father was a tin maker and fell seriously ill in his early 50s when my father was 12 years old, and was an invalid, bedridden for 4 years, and died when my father was 16. As a young boy growing up, I would hear stories from my father that, my father was sickly. I never grew up with a father. And that always baffled me that, well, his father was alive until he was 16. He was sick for the last 4 years of his life. And then when I began this relationship with his older sister and with his older brother, they would say, well, your dad was the apple of his father's eye. In fact, my father was named after his father. He would take Eddie along with him on his trips to Columbus from the Canton, Ohio area. And here you had an older sister's perception of the same family, different family stories, but I think what it did for me was to get me out of some of the intense reactivity that I had in that particular triangle, and made me, I'd like to think, a tad more objective about the family. There was a particular critical time in my marriage to my second wife that I chronicle in the chapter. And there were people in that particular family that were real resources to me. An older sister and an older brother. And even the perceptions about self. telling her his tale of woe and how he's married some of his years. The older sister says to him, you know, I never liked you that much as a child. I always thought you were kind of a know-it-all and obnoxious, and your mother doted on you too much. And then she went on to say, and that stuff about you being a priest, she said, I just thought that was odd. And one day I told your mother, she told her younger sister, that maybe she should lay off of that a little bit. And you know what your mother told me? She told me to go to hell, which was an appropriate religious response. Yeah. But once again, that opened up the intensity of the relationship with my mother and father. It gave me another view of family and their perceptions of things, and led me to question the family perceptual framework, if you will. The reconnecting with her older half-brother opened up stories about his biological father and his stepmother. And I realized that some of the reactivity in my visiting that particular man had to do with the opening up of stories that were not so over positive that she had shared, particularly with him, but her other children as well.
I want to touch that a bit because you didn't let her resistance back you off from the contact with him. How did you manage that?
You know, there's some interesting things in this, that these togetherness poles in a family, which are to think like me, behave like me, feel like me, and that somehow, if you move in a different direction, if you challenge that perceptual framework, and that could be in a variety of ways. Challenging the perceptual framework may be establishing a person-to-person relationship with a family member with whom your parent has no contact, or limited contact, or who has multiple negative stories, but staying the course. Dr. Bowen talked about there's the initial move that one makes, and he advised keeping one's own counsel. And then there's the family reactivity.
One second. What do you mean by keeping one's own counsel?
The idea that, you know, instead of running to your mother and saying, hey, guess what, I'm going to visit your older brother, you just embark on this course for self. And this is, to me, a tad bit of the differentiating process. So it's not to win the approval of your wife, your children. It's a very lonely course, but a course that one embarks on because one sees oneself as on a journey, hopefully to become a little bit more solid, if you will. And let me give you an example here. He developed a relationship with his mother's older half-brother. They visited, the one after graduate school. They would correspond. He went to his uncle's 50th wedding anniversary by himself.
And that was on the West Coast.
That was out on the West.
China. Okay.
And then he died at the wonderful age of 88. And he made a decision to go to the funeral. Well, this wife here, and of course he thought going to the funeral would be something that the family would certainly approve of or embrace. Instead, his wife got pretty reactive around the field of we can't afford was expensive, but he made a decision not to get reactive to his wife's reactivity and to stay the course with that. And so I think there developed an appreciation for these kinds of moves will precipitate, if significant enough, reactivity from family members. And if one is solid in it, one will stay the course. If one is unprepared for the intensity of the emotional process, one can get done in and then simply say, well, that's just not a good idea, or for whatever goes into that.
And letting that back you off.
Right.
I want to, one of the things that when I first thought about doing this interview with you, and it really comes out even in what we've looked at so far, you've had some of the primary theorists, Bowen himself. You've had exposure to Kerr. You mentioned Papero. I mean, these are the primary resources in this theory. And besides that, you've been plugged into the Bowen Center since, you said 78. Did I get that right?
Yes, I started a postgraduate program in 79 through 81, and then I've attended every symposium. Since then, I've presented some papers, I've done some publishing in the area, and I've been actively involved with a coach since 1987.
Okay. So if you look at being that many years involved with that caliber of people, for those of us out here at the hinterland, how do we stay plugged in? I mean, how do we get that kind of resourcing? That's incredible what you've had, the experience that you've had with some of the primary people.
Over the years, and of course, knowing many of the people who've been involved with the Georgetown Family Center, I think in my training group, there were 18 individuals, and we came from a variety of different disciplines back in 1979. There were social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists. There weren't as many clergy at that time.
Were there any clergy in your group?
I'm trying to recall, and I don't know. However, I'm always impressed with the multiplicity of ways that people find to stay connected with the theory. And it could be, and I would say this group are definitely the outliers, if you want to utilize that term. This is not mainstream social work. This is not mainstream psychiatry.
It still isn't.
No. I had to find a way that was economically feasible, but that also fed my own interest and motivation in doing as much as I can with the theory. So it's been a gradual process over time. I was in Ohio. The postgraduate training program was wonderful. Going to an annual symposium was remarkable. So all those things, I think, and seeing some of the fruits of my long labor, and that's what I tried to get at in this long-term effort in this chapter, is there might not be the payoff that one expects, that one hopes for, or in the time frame that may occur. However, Dr. Bowen used the phrase, so if you stay on course with your life and this theory makes a little bit of sense to you, and you can make your life 1/10 of 1% better, why not go for it? And I think I did a presentation once called 1/10 of 1% can make all the difference. And I guess that kind of mindset that this is a worthwhile effort and that people are creative in finding their own ways of doing that.
So we had a question that's going back to the thought of keeping one's own counsel. And the question says, how would one distinguish between self-definition and self-differentiation, which is not necessarily expressed by an act of self-definition? So maybe what's the difference in those two? And how do you say into that?
And I must confess that I have read the work of Rabbi Ed Friedman, and so I know that he utilized the term self-differentiation. That was quite foreign to me. I had not heard that until I became more aware of the folks who had studied with or had read, in primary clergy.
Hold on a second. All your work those years with Bowen, at the Bowen Center, they hadn't talked about differentiation of self?
They had. I'm talking semantics here.
Okay.
I had not heard the term self-differentiation.
How had you heard it?
Just differentiation itself. We're differentiating efforts, the process of differentiation.
Okay.
So the term is self-definition, differentiation. Maybe I can address that by looking at the fusion in my life. As a young boy, charting, and perhaps if there was some clergy watching, as a young boy in that intense parental triangle with my parents, and in the transmission of my mother's undifferentiation to me and the importance of the Roman Catholic tradition, the Jesuit tradition, my ability to be clear about who I was, about what I believed in, was blurred in the intensity of that fusion with my own mother. So that there was little separation of self from the parents in this particular case. At the decision to leave the Jesuit seminary, so 4 years in a Jesuit seminary, parenthetically, I would not change those 4 years of my life. Sure. Although I'm not a clergy, and although married to one, and though I am a Unitarian Universalist by faith tradition, those were some of the most important years in my life. As this individual, as I began to ponder maybe this religious vocation, and I not so flippantly said there were the 3 vows that religious orders take in Catholicism: poverty, chastity, and obedience. And I said, had maybe the 2nd vow been charity, I might still be a cleric. However, I became more cognizant of the opposite sex in my final semester of my undergraduate program, which was called the Juniorate. I was on a college campus, and there were these lovely co-eds, and I fell madly in love with the young co-ed. And that was the precipitant for me leaving the Society of Jesus. I would not see that as self-definition or becoming. It was a pretty reactive kind of move, although my parents would see that perhaps as rebellion.
It's quite biological, I would say.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's part of the natural system.
It was absolutely driven by an instinctual process. I recall Dr. Bowen's quote, you didn't decide to reproduce because your brain thought it was a good idea. However, my journey toward current faith tradition, which was much slower, which was much more of a thoughtful process, would be an example of, I would think, closer to defining a self. This is what I believe. This is what I stand for. These are the non-negotiables in my life. So I don't know if the listener thinks about that in terms of self-definition or self-differentiation. But that's how I think about it in terms of Dr. Bowen's writing. Who am I? What do I stand for? What do I believe in? What are those things for which I would be willing to die for, that are simply not subject to the pulls of the relationship system? And leaving the seminary was an automatic process. The developing more clearly of my own sense of a faith tradition was more along the lines of defining myself as a being who believed this.
We have another question that came in that said, what would you say were 3 primary insights for you from Bowen theory that helped you move toward differentiation of self?
Well, Unitarians have problems with 3, so I'll stay away from the 3.
Let's call it 2 plus 1.
There could be, although folks in Bowen theory talk about triangles. Certainly, one of the things that I discovered in the process as I limped along, and hopefully the chapter is not some encomium to this valiant warrior who found the answer. It's a very frail human being just trying to make a way through life, stumbling along the way, even in the midst of knowing a little bit about theory. So I think one piece that came was there is merit in the concepts within the theory. And it's more than just an intellectual exercise. There is an integration of that when one attempts to, say, simply, not so simply, bridge an emotional cutoff. So Dr. Bowen said, and I'm paraphrasing him, the most grown-up thing you'll ever do is to establish a person-to-person relationship with every member of your family. The theory is that simple. And then, of course, anybody who's endeavored to struggle with that. So that was an insight that I saw, that the value of the theory came in the living it out. Part of living it out, though, is another insight would be, how does one change a way of thinking about the world? We all grow up in our own respective families. The world's a loving place. Human beings are good. Human beings are evil. The world's a dangerous place. There are people out to get you. All these potential friends. Aunt Nettie is a drunkard. So the family is constantly giving messages, highly subjective in nature. How does one, and then there are symptoms that get tied up in a family. And so we look at someone who's depressed, and we lock that in them, and we tiptoe around them. How does one change a way of thinking about that? And I guess the difficulty that it takes to change a way of thinking. There are a variety of folks, and myself included, who want to know what are the techniques to doing this. You know, well, writing letters, doing visits, whatever. Now, a bigger question for me is, how do I change my way of thinking to become more objective? Because when I shift my way of thinking, a new way of being in all of this will automatically start to come.
Just spills out. So you can have that connection with somebody, an aunt up here,
Right.
and you're not trying to prod her for details about the family when your father was a child. It's not about prodding, it's about how that comes out in the process of this connection inside this family unit.
Yeah. I think another insight that came, and it's a wonderful question, was, and maybe with young professionals, and maybe this is a function of my senior age, there is the notion that somehow if I grab this latest fix, things will somehow be better in my family. That this is the magic that I've been looking for. I grew up in a hellish family with a hellish set of parents, and I study this for a little bit, and I'll be able to manage myself with them, or I'll be able to jettison them, as the case may be. What came through for me is shifting a way of thinking does not inoculate oneself or one's family from human problems or symptoms. Simply, there are people who've devoted their lives to Bowen theory, who have family members who themselves may get seriously ill, who develop symptoms, who get suicidal, who have drinking problems. I recount in my own chapter, I began on this effort to become more of a self, to define more of a self. And here I am in the midst of a marriage, and things build up, and there I am, student of Bowen theory, knowing about triangles, knowing about symptoms, and this individual wants to run off into another relationship, wants to run out of the second marriage, so that the initial orientation might be, well, if I study Bowen theory, that won't happen to me. Now, I realize at my fairly slow learning pace and where I am on the scale, I may limp along far more than others. But I think that great revelation that one is not inoculated from life's human problems, but one may have a way through it for self. There is a way. So that came through. And the final thing I would throw out is, like many trainees, and I was in my 30s when I got involved in this, and as I said, here I am, almost 70, and one might say, Mr. Wilgus, you're quite a slow learner, and I would certainly plead guilty to that. However, for many, this is a long-term process. I consistently, over time, underestimated the power of the family emotional process in self and in others. So those were some of the things that I've come to as a result of that.
Just for the audience, just to remember, Dr. Ott is not here. When you see her name on the screen, it's one of our staff people. And the voice you hear is not a transformed Dr. Ott. It's, again, one of our staff people. I forgot to give you that so you know what's going on out there. So go ahead with the next question.
So you said that it's a long-term thing. And how do you shift a way of thinking and live out the theory without turning it into a project, a program, a pill, or whatever that actually inhabits Bowen family system theory?
That's a thoughtful question. I remember in my early years, and perhaps even today, someone, and I raised this question for myself. Maybe, I was such a young, dogmatic Roman Catholic that maybe I became a middle-aged, dogmatic Bowen theorist, so that when this becomes the new way, the new religion, if you will, the new And I think theory struggles. People who operationalize the theory are just human beings subject to all the processes that Dr. Bowen was attempting to describe. I don't see this as a pill for everyone. I see it as a little bit closer to how humans operate in the world, a little more factual than many of the ways of thinking about human behavior to which I've been exposed. So that has some merit. And then the efforts at integrating it in my own life and seeing it play out in over time. So part of the conclusion of this chapter was I described before Bowen theory the first 30 years of my life, which included my first marriage, and the latter portion of my life, now 35 years. Had I not been exposed to Bowen theory, I might have 4, 5, or 6 marriages at this juncture in my life. I think it would be fairly predictable, given some of the functioning in my family. And I have a younger brother who is, I would say we grew up with fairly similar levels of intensity with our own parents. And my brother has had 4 marriages and 4 divorces, and I see a mirror of myself in him at different points in time. What the theory allowed me to do in the midst of this falling down a manhole was it gave me a way through it. So I did some things that were quite human in the midst of some major events in the midst of my second marriage to my wife that resulted in me getting involved with another woman. However, Bowen theory led me to do a couple of things. So one thing, in many affairs, the instinct is to keep them quiet, to keep them surreptitious. My understanding of theories of, so I'm in the middle of this damn thing. I'm not going to keep it quiet. So I went to my wife and I told her, this is, and my wife was so thoughtful about it, she took a position. Well, if you're in love with this woman, why don't you just go live with her? Which was really a fascinating tack that she took. I took the matter of this symptom in me and in our family to her parents. I took it to my parents. And in the midst of this is what's going on, we had a period of separation for 6 weeks. And then one of the things I'll return to, I took it back to my mother's older brother and sister. And my mother's older brother was this highly critical, that was the perception of him in the family. Pretty powerful figure, very opinionated. I had made attempts to make a connection with him, and I never realized triangles. My mother would tell him stories about me, and then I'd try to make contact and didn't know what happened. You know, there it is. People are always talking about you behind your back. You just don't know about it. You know, those are interlocking triangles. Yeah. So I went to this uncle, and with fear and trepidation, and the theory led me to do that. Nothing else. I think without fear, I wouldn't have done that. And I told him my tale of misery, and he sat there and he listened. And he, after he heard it all, this opinionated, critical man patted me on the knee and said, Anthony, I know you'll do the right thing. Now, keep in mind, I didn't know the right he didn't tell me the right thing.
Right.
But moving it out of the intensity of the marital relationship back up into the family. My mother's sister, after she heard my tale of woe and shared stories, I thought you were this kind of obnoxious little academic nerd. She goes, "You're not so bad after all. You're just human." So the very act of running counter to the feeling process based upon some principle, thought out principle, was a feature of Bowen theory that then led through a series for the two of them to recommit to their marriage. She had had a case of multiple sclerosis, which then intensified, but then allowed the two of them to walk together through that particular illness right to her death. And this is the outcome, that 0.1% difference that I talk about. And I'll give you an example of that later on, right here. When she was a freshman in high school, her sister had just graduated from high school. And her mother was in a wheelchair. And she said to me, her father, "Dad, do you think Mom will be alive when I graduate from high school?" And part of my effort in dealing was always stick to the facts. And I said to my daughter, my youngest, "I do not know if your mother will be alive. But what I do know is that whatever happens, we will walk through this together as a family." Having that confidence. And then, 4 years later, the mother did stay alive for her youngest daughter's graduation, and died 6 months after she graduated, so she got her children launched. Having seen the impact of theory over the course of slips and failures, falls, 2 steps back, a step forward, 3 steps back, a couple steps forward, and then seeing it result in a little more orderliness in life is compelling in a way, for me personally, that is almost difficult to explain unless people have somehow experienced it themselves.
I want to touch on a quote with your book around that time. You used the words, and I think I have this correct, from about page 199 or so. There's a human behind every symptom, and that person is not defined by an illness. I know you unpacked that some in the chapter, but in some of the time we have left, would you just touch on that again? Because I think there are some significant implications for how you thought about that and our functioning as clergy in the role of pastoral care or pastoral counseling.
Well, let me tell you an extended family story, and I see we have another question. We'll get to that too. I had developed a relationship with my father's older sister, to the point that we had done some one-to-one things. I was free to ask her out for dinner and for lunch. And she told me I had been living in a section of Ohio, a story about her high school experience, that when she was a young girl, her father was deathly ill. Her sister had been diagnosed with a brain tumor. Her maternal grandmother was failing. And there was a young high school teacher who said to her at the end of class, "Madeline, how are you doing?" And my dad's older sister just broke down and wept. And she explained, every day is difficult. I don't know when my father's going to die. My gifted older sister is dying of a brain tumor. My mother's overwhelmed. This was in the days of the Depression, 1930 to 32. And this teacher took this young student under her wing. And the family was too poor. She couldn't afford a graduation dress. So this teacher bought my dad's sister a graduation dress. She couldn't afford a high school annual. This teacher made sure that she had a high school annual. Well, flash forward some 60 years. My aunt tells me that this teacher, her beloved teacher, is in a residential facility for elderly in the community in which I was living at the time, and that she had Alzheimer's, but that she very much wanted to go visit this teacher. And so my aunt asked me, not my father or any of my siblings, she goes, Anthony, would you come with me? And I said, I'd be delighted to. We went to the nursing home and we requested to see this woman. And this 90-something woman, perfectly coiffed white hair, who looked like a high school teacher, came down. And we went and sat at a table, and my aunt took her hands and talked to her. And she said, you may not remember me, but you were a teacher at McKinley High School. And then the woman said, well, yes, I was. And I was one of the students in your class. She says, oh, you were. And I want to tell you how kind you were to me at a very different, and she just recounted these stories again and again. I sat there and I wept. And they embraced, and this woman had this, to me, lucid conversation with my father's sister. And I walked away from that realizing that my aunt had encountered the person behind the symptom. That many of us humans, myself included, will stop at a psychiatric symptom, at a physical symptom, at a social symptom. Oh, he's an alcoholic, or she's depressed, or bipolar, fill in the blanks.
Sure.
But the notion that there is a human being, a person, lurking behind there, if you pay attention, and don't let that get in the way. So that when my wife became ill, and there are periods in people's lives, we talk about self-definition. How am I going to think about a chronic illness in a family? How am I going to think about a family member who has a chronic illness? So the lessons learned in my extended family work, there's a human being behind multiple sclerosis. No matter how compromised that individual may appear to my senses, so that there were communications as she began to lose her ability to talk. And it would be somewhat humorous. He would say to her, I know your brain is still working. And she would just reply, yes, it is. And that was very, and even to the point shortly before her death, when her systems were failing, she was able to communicate to her husband that it was time for her to die. So this kind of ability to develop that person-to-person relationship with as many people in one's extended family as possible is a way to grow up. The other thing I would throw up, Dr. Bowen was suggesting this too. And these are my recollections. I'm not quoting Dr. Bowen, and I would pretend. But my recollection of a story he told was a man, he was suggesting to a man to get in touch with a family member. And the family member said, oh, she's depressed. And Dr. Bowen said, well, how do you know she just isn't depressed when you're around? that you're only seeing one segment of people.
Yeah.
But that kind of ability to have that person-to-person contact.
I mean, I think that, I'm sure these clergy that are listening are hearing this, but from my view, when I read that and I thought about that in terms of pastoral care, I think when it comes to our field of pastoral care, if we can just get that, that's as good as all the textbooks put together, that contacting that person in there and finding it, touching it.
Yeah.
That's really the soul work of such students. I have a question. Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about the benefits that you've seen of working with the theory through your life. We had somebody here who asked about, you've had a coach for nearly 3 decades. And kind of what are some of the benefits of the coaching relationship that you've had?
Good question. The path for me, and I've gotten to the point where actually, colleagues have come to me, do you know a good therapist or who do I go to? And that always perplexed me as I got more familiar with the theory. Yeah. So what I've taken to do, for good or for ill, is this is what worked for me. And shifting a way of thinking about the world is not an overnight project, and certainly not one for me. So consequently, having a neutral outsider, somebody, and for me, selecting a coach was a very serious endeavor. I wanted a coach. Now, I could have gone face-to-face with people. In fact, some of my coaching in the early years was done over the phone. There were family members who found out about us, lovely family members who said, oh, that's baloney. I have to have a face-to-face. And part of this is just knowing who you are, knowing what you do, and going with it. And I was able to not get reactive. No, this wouldn't work for this cousin or this individual over here. But it was imperative that I had a coach who was conversant with the theory, around who I could chronicle the struggles, the challenges, and who was able to listen and ask thoughtful questions about the challenges in which I was immersed. So, the 30-year effort, I plead guilty to being a plotter in all of this. For me, the theory and integrating the theory did not come quickly. The coaching sessions at this point in my life, they were really much up to me. If I wanted to have a coaching consultation session monthly, I could do that. If I wanted it every 3 months, I could do that. I could intersperse it with trips to the symposium, however. So that was important. The second thing about coaching is, when does it usually happen? And maybe with clergy this will resonate. Many of you know that people come to church when they're in a crisis and when they have children. Those are nodal points of entry into a faith tradition. I think those are not uncommon for selecting a professional. For me, the catapulting, so I've been exposed to the post-grading. When I started to get into some marital difficulties in the mid-'80s, and my wife was threatening to leave and things were not going well, it was the realization, this is bigger than I can manage on my own. And I think seeing the value of that over time made me stay consistent with the effort. So I would say the other thing is, people usually come when the roof is caving in, the floor is caving in, the house is on fire. But I had to find a way of thinking that was similar to and congruent with what I was attempting to think about the world as I understood Bowen theory.
I want to shift again, just a tad. married about 10 years, give or take, right about 10, is that right?
That's correct.
To a clergy person, and you were the clergy spouse.
Right.
So you've had a kind of an inside-outside position to this clergy world. Can you just talk to us a bit about your observations of this thing called differentiation of self and clergy, and how all that may fit or may not fit? I just was curious about that.
Sure. Well, I talk about life coming full circle. I started off thinking I was going to be a Jesuit priest and I was going to be a missionary or a scholar or so forth. And then I embarked upon this journey. Part of the point of the chapter, my earlier marriages were pretty impulsive and quick, very similar to my parents' marriage to each other. I think after the death of my wife in 2002, theory led me to just take time to slow down. And I was in my mid-50s. At the time, I was not interested in getting into another relationship. That was me. I just wanted some time for myself. And as it transpired several years, this minister, how it came to be, had been instrumental in, my wife and I had been part of a group that started a church in part of Ohio. I'd never had that church. And my two younger daughters very much, and my wife, admired her tremendously. So she was cognizant and aware of that particular family. She left when she was 15 and she was 12, and when she left, they both said to her, "When we grow up, will you be the minister to marry us?" So I had loosed, and she said, no one has said before that or since that. Fast forward, I had done letters of reference for her, and after my wife died, she had indicated that she was applying for a couple of jobs, and would I be a reference? And I did, and she sent her condolences, and she said her life had changed, and she'd been divorced. And so she was on the East Coast, and this daughter comes to me at the age of 22 and said, "Dad, do you know where Beth is?" I said, "Well, she's in the church out in Long Island." And so she and her fiance at the time made contact, and she agreed to do the wedding service. And it had been almost 3 years since my wife died, and I came in at the rehearsal dinner, and at the rehearsal at the church, and I was absolutely smitten. I fell off into the pew or whatever was available at the time. I tried to keep my wits about me. Shortly thereafter, I wrote her a letter, and I did not know she was involved. And later, when we were engaged, I think my coach made the comment. He said, "Tony, you dog, you're supposed to give your daughter away, not run off with the minister in a marriage." But a year later, it'll be 11 years in May. And my point in this effort was the marriage to my wife, Beth, was part of an outcome of a much more orderly process that would not have been so orderly. Well, I wouldn't have stayed married to my second wife. And the lens by which I was looking at myself, often when you look at people and how they make major life decisions, can be, as Dr. Bowen suggested, a way to look at their level of differentiation. So, marrying a clergyman, there were a couple of things. My wife was a younger sister brother, so we were very compatible. My first wife had an older brother, and so there was a degree of compatibility. I've never been involved with an oldest, so there There was who had a younger brother.
I see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's been an interesting series of negotiations that continues on a regular basis around my need not to be taken care of.
And her need at times not to be taken care of.
Exactly. At the same time, becoming a member now, when I married my wife, my father somewhat jokingly said, because he was baffled by my selection of faith tradition, well, when I married Beth, that Tony finally found God. Or he finally found religion. He may not believe in heaven or hell, but he believes in heaven right now. And I agreed with him. So there was a lot of banter about that. Being connected to one's spouse in any profession is always a challenge when one is exposed to a little bit of voluntary. I think there are some unique challenges, and I'm sure any clergy spouse that's listening or clergy member who has a partner will talk about the triangles that get going in that process. My effort in that was to kind of sit in the back pew, keep a low profile. We have different last names. I never introduced myself as the spouse of the clergy member. People would be baffled sometimes. Do you know that clergy is senior minister? Yes, I do. Anyway, and then congregants, typically will do the maneuvering. One of the more humorous triangles I thought was an older congregant came to me and he was pumping me for questions about what my wife's thinking, the senior minister's thinking. And I said, I seriously don't know what she thinks on that. He said, well, you share the same pillow. And I said to him, Mr. So-and-so, when we're sharing the same pillow, we're not talking about those kinds of things. And he laughed. So I
unstuck the triangle.
But it lightened the mood.
Yeah. We have some online? Okay, are we at 12? Well, my alarm didn't work. For what it's worth, I had it set, but it doesn't mean it went off, or if it did, I didn't feel it. So thank you for being a part of this, and thank you, Tony, for being a part of this. By the way, I thought of a title for your book. It's From Jesuit Priest to Unitarian Clergy Spouse.
There you go.
I'm not sure that would sell, but
I know. In certain circles.
Well, thank you for being part of this, and I hope you got half as much as I did. This has been a fantastic time. Thank you.
And thank all of you for tuning in. Thank you, Bob.
And thanks for the staff for adjusting to all kinds of glitches.
Yes.
Thanks, Lance. Take care.